The Uncomfortable Prophecy, Enoch Powell, Demographic Change, and the Limits of European Integration. Introduction: The Speech That Would Not Fall. On April 20th, 1968, Enoch Powell rose before an audience of Conservative Party activists at the Midland Hotel in Birmingham and delivered what would become the most divisive political speech in modern British history. He had told a friend beforehand that his words would fizz like a rocket, but whereas all rockets fall to earth, this one will stay up. 5 decades later, that prophecy about the speech itself has proven remarkably accurate. Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, so named for his closing quotation from Virgil's Aeneid, "Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood," was an extraordinary act of political courage or political suicide, depending on one's perspective. He was immediately sacked from the shadow cabinet by Conservative leader Edward Heath, who called the speech racialist in tone and liable to exacerbate racial tensions. Yet opinion polls showed over 70% public support for Powell's views, thousands wrote letters of praise, and dockers marched through Westminster carrying "Don't Knock Enoch" placards. For decades, Powell was treated as a pariah in polite British society, a figure whose name became synonymous with racism and whose warnings were dismissed as the rantings of a bigot. In recent years, however, a more complex reassessment has emerged. Roger Scruton, writing on the 40th anniversary of the speech, argued that such predictions as Powell made in his speech concerning the tipping of the demographic balance, the ghettoisation of the industrial cities, and the growth of resentment among the indigenous working class have been fulfilled. Scruton concluded that Enoch Powell was far nearer the truth than those who instantly drove him from office. This essay seeks to examine dispassionately what Powell got right, what he got wrong, and why the uncomfortable questions he raised about immigration, cultural compatibility, and demographic change remain with us today. It will address the crucial distinction between past European migrations, which occurred within a shared Judeo-Christian civilizational framework, and contemporary migration from culturally distant regions, driven by economic incentives rather than cultural affinity. It will also consider why immigrants from the developing world overwhelmingly choose wealthy Western nations rather than other developing regions, the demographic arithmetic of fertility differentials, and the export of homeland political ideologies through diaspora communities. 1. The context: post-war Britain and the Windrush generation. The backdrop to Powell's speech was 2 decades of profound demographic change. When the SS Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury on June 22, 1948, carrying 492 West Indian passengers, few could have predicted the scale of the transformation that would follow. These migrants were actively recruited to address severe labour shortages in post-war Britain. The 1948 British Nationality Act reaffirmed that all Commonwealth subjects had the right to enter and settle in the UK. Prime Minister Clement Attlee defended this open-door policy, writing that it was traditional that British subjects, whether of Dominion or colonial origin, and of whatever race or colour, should be freely admissible to the United Kingdom. Yet, beneath the official rhetoric of imperial brotherhood, public sentiment was far more ambivalent. By the late 1950s, West Indians were arriving at a rate of around 50,000 annually. Colour bars in housing and employment were widespread. The 1958 race riots in Notting Hill and Nottingham exposed deep-seated racial tensions, with white teenagers roaming the streets attacking immigrant families. In Notting Hill, some 700 people rampaged through the streets chanting, "Kill the niggers." One black student was saved from a savage beating only by the intervention of a grocer's wife. Powell's Wolverhampton constituency had become a focal point of these tensions. The West Midlands had attracted a disproportionate share of black and Asian immigrants in the 1950s, when its manufacturing sector was booming. A decade later, as the economic pendulum swung against British industry, these communities became scapegoats. In the 1964 Smethwick election, Conservative candidate Peter Griffiths won using the slogan, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour." It was in this atmosphere of economic anxiety and visible demographic change that Powell delivered his speech. 2. Powell's argument: numbers, culture, and the fear of transformation. Powell's speech was anchored in a central insight. Numbers are of the essence, he declared. The significance and consequences of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%. He cited official figures projecting that by 1985 there would be 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants, rising to 5 to 7 million by 2000, approximately 1/10 of the population. He recounted a conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man, who told him, "In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man." Powell insisted he had no choice but to report such sentiments. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking, not throughout Great Britain perhaps, but in the areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in 1,000 years of English history. He warned of specific pressures. 20 or 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week. He described a letter from an elderly white woman who was allegedly the last white resident on her street. He attacked the Race Relations Bill then before Parliament, arguing that it would create a one-way privilege that cannot, and is not intended to, operate to protect them or redress their grievances. He warned that to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder. His peroration was stark. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, but which there is interwoven with the history and existence of the states itself, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. 3. The crucial distinction: European versus non-European immigration. To understand both the power and the limits of Powell's argument, one must recognise the distinction he was implicitly drawing, one that is often lost in contemporary debates. When critics point to the successful integration of previous waves of immigration, Irish, Poles, Jews, they often elide a crucial difference. These earlier migrations occurred within a broadly shared European, Judeo-Christian civilizational framework. The cultural distance between Irish Catholics and British Protestants, for example, was significant but ultimately bridgeable through shared Christian heritage, geographic proximity, and centuries of mutual, if often hostile, interaction. Contemporary mass migration from South Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa presents a different challenge. The cultural and religious frameworks are more distant from the European societies receiving them. This is not a matter of inherent racial superiority, but of practical social cohesion. The core question is whether societies can successfully integrate populations from radically different cultural backgrounds at the scale and speed witnessed in recent decades. Powell understood this intuitively. While he spoke in the language of race that was common in his era, his deeper concern was cultural. He warned that immigrants were not absorbing European or Western way of life, and that this failure would lead to dangerous fragmentation within society. He explicitly distinguished between Commonwealth immigrants and the American Negro population, noting that the latter were already in existence before the United States became a nation and had started literally as slaves, whereas Commonwealth immigrants came to Britain as a full citizen to a country which knew no discrimination between one citizen and another. This was a prescient observation. The American civil rights struggle involved the integration of a population that had been part of the nation since its founding, albeit as an oppressed minority. The British situation involved the large-scale importation of populations who had no historical connection to Britain, no shared cultural memory, and no organic stake in the nation's traditions. 4. The myth of automatic assimilation. The liberal assumption that guided post-war immigration policy, that immigrants would naturally assimilate over time, has proved overly optimistic. Academic research on family patterns among immigrants and their descendants in the UK, France, and Germany reveals significant variation by origin, but also persistent differences that do not simply dissolve across generations. A major study by Kulu and colleagues found that South Asians and Turkish populations exhibit marriage-centered family behavior with elevated third birth rates. This means that while European native populations have moved toward cohabitation and lower fertility, these immigrant groups maintain higher marriage rates and larger families. The researchers found that some patterns to persist across future migrant generations, for example, preference for marriage versus cohabitation, whereas others are likely to vanish, for example, large families. But the persistence of partnership patterns is significant. It suggests that deep-seated cultural orientations toward marriage and family structure are more resistant to change than liberal theorists assumed. This has demographic consequences. When a population group has higher fertility rates and receives continuous inflows through family reunification and chain migration, its share of the total population grows. When the native population has below replacement fertility, the proportional shift is accelerated. This is not replacement in a conspiratorial sense. It is simple arithmetic. Scruton made this point forcefully. Many of the newcomers to Britain would be strangers to liberal values, attached to their own communities, suspicious towards the host culture, and anxious to insulate themselves and their children from its influence. He accused the political class of practicing doublethink, including the proposition that pious Muslims from the hinterlands of Asia would produce children loyal to a secular European state. 5. The economic gravity of migration. Powell's critics have often accused him of failing to understand that immigrants contribute to the economy. But this misses his deeper point. Powell acknowledged that some immigrants made valuable contributions. He explicitly exempted Commonwealth doctors who, to the advantage of their own countries, have enabled our hospital service to be expanded faster than would otherwise have been possible. His concern was not with selective skilled migration, but with mass, unselective inflows. Recent migration data provides a more nuanced picture. The UK's net migration has fallen from a peak of 944,000 in 2023 to 171,000 in the year ending December 2025. The main driver is a fall in non-EU immigration, particularly for work-related reasons, which declined by 47%. However, the composition of that migration remains concentrated from specific regions. The top nationalities for asylum claims include Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Sudan. Indian nationals continue to dominate several UK visa categories, including health and care worker visas, 107,306 extensions, and skilled worker visas, 89,851 extensions. A crucial question here is, why do these migrants leave their independent countries and head to richer northern European nations, Canada, Australia, and the US rather than to Africa or Pacific Islands? The answer is economic gravity. Migration follows material incentives, higher wages, generous welfare states, established diaspora networks, and political stability. A Pakistani or Bangladeshi migrant has vastly greater economic opportunity in London or Birmingham than in Lagos or Vanuatu. The welfare state itself acts as a magnet. Healthcare, education, housing benefits, and child welfare are more generous in Northern Europe and North America than in developing nations. This creates a powerful selection effect. The most economically motivated migrants, often with lower skills, head to the wealthiest destinations. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observable pattern. Migration flows follow economic gravity, not proximity or cultural similarity. That is precisely why Europe, North America, and Australia face integration challenges that regions like Africa or the Pacific do not. They are the destinations of choice for economic migrants and asylum seekers from across the globe. 6. Diaspora, the politics and the export of homeland conflicts. One of the more complex dimensions of contemporary migration, and one that Powell could not have fully anticipated, is the phenomenon of transnational diaspora politics. Immigrants do not simply leave their homelands behind. They often maintain strong political and cultural ties to their countries of origin, and those ties can reshape host country politics. A striking example is the growth of Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, in the Indian diaspora. Edward T. G. Anderson's research demonstrates that transnational Hindutva cannot simply be viewed as an export. This phenomenon has evolved and been shaped into an important aspect of diasporic identity, a way for people to connect with their homeland. Thousands of expatriates are actively involved in its promotion, whether through funding, campaign work, or public advocacy. This has had tangible effects on British multiculturalism, migrant politics, and relations between various minoritized communities. More controversially, there is evidence of collaboration between Hindu nationalist and white far-right movements in the UK. A leaked National Police Chiefs Council report revealed that Tommy Robinson, the far-right activist, had met with Hindu groups to promote anti-Muslim campaigns. In 2016, the National Council of Hindu Temples invited Robinson to speak at their annual conference, though the event was later cancelled after protests. The 2024 UK race riots saw far-right actors collaborate with Hindutva propagandists to spread disinformation and incite violence against Muslims. This reveals a pattern that complicates simple narratives of immigrant assimilation. Diaspora communities are not passive recipients of host country culture. They are active agents who bring their own political and religious commitments, and those commitments can shape the host society in unpredictable ways. When combined with demographic growth, this can lead to the transformation of host country politics along lines that reflect the competing identities of immigrant groups. This is not to single out any particular community. Similar patterns are visible among Turkish communities in Germany supporting Erdogan, among diaspora groups supporting various homelands, and among any number of immigrant communities maintaining transnational ties. The point is that mass migration does not simply involve individuals moving from one country to another. It involves the transfer of cultural and political identities that can reshape the receiving society. 7. The demographic tipping point. The core of Powell's demographic argument was that, once a certain threshold is crossed, the transformation of a society becomes irreversible. He warned that the significance and consequences of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%. The question of tipping points, the point at which demographic change becomes self-sustaining regardless of policy interventions, remains central to contemporary debates. The evidence is mixed but suggestive. The academic study of family trajectories found that South Asian and Turkish populations in Europe exhibit marriage-centered family behavior with elevated third birth rates. This indicates persistent fertility differentials that could contribute to demographic change over time. The researchers found that the preference for marriage versus cohabitation was likely to persist across future migrant generations. This has implications for the host society. In 1968, Powell's demographic projections were derided as racist scaremongering. Yet they proved broadly accurate. He predicted that immigrants and their descendants would number 5 to 7 million by 2000, and the actual figure was higher. The question is not whether demographic change has occurred, it clearly has, but whether this change constitutes a problem requiring policy response. Scruton argued that by silencing Powell, British political elites ensured that immigration can be discussed only now, when it is too late to do anything about it or to confine it to those who come in a spirit of obedience towards the indigenous law. The political consequences of this failure are visible in the rise of Reform UK, the AFD in Germany, the National Rally in France, and similar movements across Europe. These parties represent a constituency that believes immigration has gone too far, and that political elites have failed to address their concerns. Recent UK migration data shows that net migration has fallen but remains at levels that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations. 171,000 in the year ending December 2025. While this is down from the peak of 944,000 in 2023, it is still a significant number, driven primarily by non-EU nationals. Study continues to be the top reason for coming to the UK, followed by work. Asylum claims remain substantial, with Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Sudan as the top nationalities. 8. What Powell got right, what he got wrong. Powell's critics have rightly condemned his rhetoric and his willingness to inflame racial tensions. His description of excreta push through her letterbox and charming, wide-grinned pickaninnies was deliberately provocative and designed to appeal to the worst instincts of his audience. He made no effort to distinguish between legitimate concerns about immigration and outright bigotry. He opposed the Race Relations Act, which was necessary to combat discrimination. His vision of re-emigration was both unrealistic and morally unacceptable. Yet dispassionate assessment requires acknowledging what he got right. First, he correctly identified that the scale of immigration matters. The difference between 1% and 10% of the population is not merely quantitative, but qualitative. At 1%, a minority can be absorbed with minimal social disruption. At 10%, the minority is large enough to form parallel institutions, maintain distinct cultural practices, and influence politics. Second, he understood that cultural compatibility matters for integration. European immigrants to the US assimilated over generations because they shared a broadly compatible civilizational framework. Mass immigration from culturally distant regions requires deliberate integration policies and cannot be assumed to happen automatically. Third, he recognized that economic incentives drive migration patterns. Immigrants from the developing world overwhelmingly choose wealthy Western nations because that is where the opportunities are, not because of cultural affinity. This creates a selection effect that shapes the composition of immigration. Fourth, he understood that demographic change has political consequences. When populations change rapidly, the native population feels alienated and resentful, particularly when they perceive that their concerns are being dismissed by elites. This resentment fuels political backlash, which can take dangerous forms. Fifth, he correctly warned that poorly managed immigration could lead to ethnic and religious conflict. While the rivers of blood he predicted did not materialize in the apocalyptic form he envisaged, the UK has experienced significant race-related violence: the 1981 Brixton riots, the 2001 Northern England riots, the 2005 London bombings, the 2011 riots, the 2024 race riots, and continuing tensions around Islamist extremism, grooming gangs, and inter-community violence. What Powell got wrong was his certainty of doom. He underestimated the capacity of immigrant communities to integrate, the resilience of British institutions, and the power of economic and social incentives to break down cultural barriers. He was wrong to believe that Britain would inevitably descend into racial warfare. He was wrong to dismiss the possibility that multicultural Britain could become a functioning, if imperfect, society. 9. Conclusion. Powell's uncomfortable legacy. 50 years after the Rivers of Blood speech, Powell's legacy remains contested. His defenders see him as a truth-teller who warned of dangers that others refused to see. His detractors see him as a racist who legitimized hatred and set back race relations for decades. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. Powell's great insight was that mass immigration from culturally distant regions, without deliberate integration policies, would transform British society in ways that many would find uncomfortable. He understood that numbers are of the essence and that demographic change has political and cultural consequences. He recognized that previous waves of European integration succeeded because they occurred within a shared civilizational framework. He appreciated that economic incentives drive migration patterns in ways that are not always congruent with national interests. He correctly predicted that political elites would be in denial about these realities. Yet Powell's vision was also profoundly limited. He treated immigrants as an undifferentiated threat rather than as individuals with their own agency and aspirations. He failed to appreciate that integration is a process that takes time. He was wrong to dismiss the possibility that a multi-ethnic Britain could become a successful society. He was wrong to oppose legislation against racial discrimination, which was necessary to protect vulnerable communities from prejudice. The contemporary resonance of Powell's speech lies in the fact that the questions he raised about cultural compatibility, demographic change, social cohesion, and political will remain unresolved. The UK continues to debate immigration, integration, national identity, and the limits of multiculturalism. These debates are conducted in an atmosphere still shaped by Powell's legacy, though his name is rarely invoked. In the end, the uncomfortable truth is that Powell was both right and wrong. He was right that mass immigration would transform British society. He was right that cultural differences matter. He was right that elites would be in denial. He was right that demographic change can have profound consequences. But he was wrong that the transformation would be catastrophic. He was wrong that integration was impossible. He was wrong that the River Tiber would necessarily foam with much blood. The reality is more complex, more ambiguous, and, ultimately, more hopeful than Powell allowed. Britain has become a more multi-ethnic society than Powell could have imagined. It has also, against his predictions, remained a functioning democracy with a strong rule of law. The challenges of integration persist, but so do the successes. The lesson is not that Powell was entirely right or entirely wrong, but that the issues he raised were real, important, and ignored at society's peril. Last reflections: the mountaintop and the gathering dusk. And so we return to where we began, to Enoch Powell standing before his audience in Birmingham, speaking of rivers of blood, and to the deeper currents of history that his words, however imperfectly, sought to name. The long arc of European history. If we ascend to the mountaintop and gaze across the vast panorama of human history, what do we see? We see the slow, patient movement of peoples across continents, the Indo-Aryan migrations that brought the ancestors of modern Europeans from the steppes of Central Asia into the heart of Europe. Those who had become white were not always white. They became so through millennia of adaptation, of intermixing with the peoples they encountered, of the gradual formation of distinct identities in the crucible of geography and climate. The whiteness of Europe is not eternal. It is a historical product, a temporary arrangement of genes and culture that emerged from movement and change. We see the long interaction between Christian Europe and the Islamic world, centuries of warfare, trade, intellectual exchange, and cultural borrowing. The Muslims were in Spain for 700 years. They were at the gates of Vienna. Yet, for all the conflicts, there were no race riots in the modern sense. The boundaries between civilizations were clearly drawn, and those who crossed them did so as conquerors, traders, or small-scale migrants, not as mass populations that would fundamentally transform the character of the receiving societies. The other was at the frontier, not in the heartland. Then came the Great Rupture, the European discovery of the Americas. This was a one-way movement. Europeans went to the Americas, not the other way around. Colonialism established patterns of dominance and extraction that would shape the modern world. The colonized peoples, whether in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, were kept at a distance, both geographically and socially. The empires built by European nations were hierarchies of power in which the colonizer remained distinct from the colonized, the master separate from the servant. And then, in the 20th century, the reversal. The subjects of empire who had been kept at a distance came to the metropole. The colonized came to the colonizer's homeland. This was the great unwinding of empire, and it caught the Europeans by surprise. They had basked in the glory of empire, secure in the assumption that the peoples they ruled would remain in their distant lands. They had not anticipated that, when the empire ended, those same peoples would come to settle in Europe itself. The owl of Minerva, the symbol of wisdom, spreads its wings only at dusk, only when the day is done and it is too late to change what has been set in motion. The collision of world views. What Powell glimpsed, though he could not fully articulate it, was the collision of world views that mass migration would bring. The assumption that had underpinned European liberalism, that the values of tolerance, secularism, democracy, and individual rights were universal, was being tested by populations that did not share that assumption. Many immigrants from traditional societies brought with them values that were fundamentally different, a greater emphasis on community over individuality, on religious authority over secular law, on family loyalty over personal autonomy. These immigrants, it is said, will not assimilate. They will maintain their own communities, their own languages, their own customs, their own loyalties. They will form parallel societies within the heart of Europe, creating islands of otherness in the sea of Western civilization. And those who defend this arrangement call it multiculturalism, a noble word for a process that may, in the end, dissolve the very culture that makes tolerance possible. The Christians and the Romans. A troubling parallel. The historical parallel that haunts this discussion is the early Christians in the Roman Empire. Christianity began as a small, persecuted sect within a vast pagan civilization. The Christians were seen as strange, disruptive, and dangerous. Atheists who refused to worship the gods, separatists who withdrew from the public life of the empire, subversives who owed their highest allegiance to a kingdom not of this world. The Christians claimed exclusivity on the basis of their superior religion. They refused to participate in the civic rituals that bound the empire together. They would not serve in the military, would not hold public office, would not acknowledge the divine status of the emperor. They were, in the eyes of their contemporaries, bad citizens, people who took the benefits of Roman civilization while rejecting its obligations. The Christians were not merely a different religion, they were a counter-society, a rival community that claimed a higher allegiance and a deeper truth. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, identified the rise of Christianity as one of the principal causes of Rome's weakening. The Christians' refusal to participate fully in the life of the empire, their withdrawal from public service, their cultivation of a separate identity, all of this, Gibbon argued, drained the empire of the civic energy that had made it great. Rome did not fall to barbarian invasions alone. It fell, in part, because its citizens no longer believed in Rome. The Christians had created a parallel society within the empire, and in doing so, they had hastened its decline. The contemporary situation is different in its mechanisms, but parallel in its structure. The Christians transformed the Roman Empire through conversion, through the slow spread of a new faith that claimed universal truth. The immigrants of today transform Europe through demography, through the steady accumulation of numbers that changes the character of the society from within. But like the early Christians, they claim exclusivity on the basis of their distant cultures, their different religions, their alternative ways of life. These immigrants are not Christians. They are Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, followers of faiths that do not share the Christian heritage of Europe. They pay taxes, it is true. They contribute to the economy, often in low-paid and difficult jobs. But they also claim exclusivity. They maintain their own communities, their own schools, their own legal customs. They refuse, in many cases, to participate fully in the public life of their new homelands. They do not intermarry at the rates that would indicate assimilation. They do not adopt European values at the rates that would indicate integration. They are, in this sense, like the early Christians, a counter-society within the heart of the empire, taking the benefits of the civilization while withholding full allegiance. They do not seek to convert Europeans. They seek to live among them, and in living among them, to transform them. The transformation is not through persuasion, but through proximity, not through faith, but through fertility. Hegel wrote that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk. By this, he meant that philosophy, wisdom, understanding, the deep comprehension of historical events, comes only when the events are over, when the day is done and the night has fallen. We understand history only when it is too late to change it. The Europeans who built their empires, who recruited workers from their colonies, who opened their doors to their former subjects, they were acting in the light of day, confident in their power and their values. They believed that they were bringing civilization to the world, that their way of life was superior, that the colonized would be grateful for the gift of European culture. They did not foresee that the colonized might one day come to live among them, that the children of the empire might become citizens of the metropole, that the balance of population might shift so dramatically that the Europeans themselves might become a minority in their own homelands. Now, in the gathering dusk of their demographic dominance, they begin to see what they have wrought. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings, and the Europeans, blinking in the twilight, look upon a world they no longer recognize. The people who once ruled the globe now find themselves wondering if they will survive as a distinct people, if their culture will endure, if their children will inherit the world their ancestors built. The triumph of the colonized? The deepest fear that underlies the immigration debate, a fear that Powell's speech gave voice to, is that the white race, the European population that has dominated the world for the past 5 centuries, will be reduced further, perhaps to the point of extinction, as the colonized world effectively triumphs through migration. Not through conquest, not through war, but through the simple arithmetic of birth and movement. The colonized have come to the colonizer's homeland, not as conquerors, but as migrants seeking a better life. They bring with them their children, their customs, their faiths. They have higher birth rates than the native population. They are younger, more fertile, more vibrant. And the native population, aging and declining, watches as its share of the population shrinks year by year, decade by decade. Is this a triumph? Some would say yes, that it is the just reversal of centuries of exploitation, the reckoning that was always coming. Others would say no, that it is the destruction of a civilization, the slow suicide of the West, And still others would say that it is neither, that it is simply the movement of peoples, the flow of history, the eternal pattern of rise and fall that has characterized human civilization since the beginning. From the mountaintop, one can see both perspectives. One can see the justice in the reversal, the poetic irony of the colonized inheriting the land of the colonizer. And one can see the tragedy in the loss, the sorrow of a civilization that gave so much to the world, now fading into the shadows of history. All we can do is watch and wonder and hope that the rivers of blood will remain only a metaphor, a warning from the past, not a prophecy of the future. All we can do is climb the mountain, look out over the vast panorama of history, and see both the common humanity that binds us and the differences that divide us. All we can do is remember that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings at dusk, but that dawn too follows the night.